Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this webinar on downward branch dieback and mango crops, symptoms and management. My name is Leonardo Ortega, and I'm the Research Director of the National Mango Board, and I will be moderating this webinar. So to get started with our webinar today, downward branch dieback and mango crops, symptoms and management, I would like to present our speaker for today, Dr. Rafael Gómez Jaimes, who has worked with us on other webinars as well. Dr. Gómez, welcome. He is a researcher from the National Institute for Research in Forestry, Agriculture, and Fisheries in Mexico, INIFA, where he has been working since 2008. And he is based at the Santiago Escuintla Experimental Farm in Nayarit. Dr. Gómez is an agricultural engineer with a specialization in agricultural parasitology. He also has a master's degree in plant protection, as well as a doctorate in phytopathology. And during his academic and professional work, he has published more than 23 scientific articles. He has co-authored 6 books and other chapters as well, and he has co-authored 10 technical brochures. He has also presented 30 summaries and other work in different conferences. He has directed more than 2 theses and given many workshops on diseases and plant health. His areas of research focus on management of diseases in tropical fruits, vegetables, and staple crops. And his research has been primarily focused on mangoes, soursop, Persian limes, avocados, and vegetables. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Rafael Gómez. Please go ahead, Dr. Gómez. Good afternoon to everyone who are joining us this afternoon. And first off, I would like to thank the National Mango Board for this invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be able to participate in these workshops. And this workshop today is a workshop I hope will be useful for you. And part of the information from this workshop, I hope that you will be able to apply it in your orchards. And so I hope this information proves to be very useful for you. So we're going to get started with this course regarding downward branch dieback and mango crops. And we're going to talk a little bit about the causes of the disease, the symptoms, and some of the strategies that can be used to be able to manage this disease. So I'll start in with some of this information now. We're going to talk about downward branch dieback, as I had mentioned. The downward branch dieback is called downward branch dieback because it starts in the apical area, the highest part of the tree, and moves down to the trunk. It also occurs in other crops, not just mangoes, different fruit as well, and other forest trees, where this downward branch dieback is due to different fungi in the Botryosphaeriaceae family. This family of fungi includes around 22 genera of fungi and about 300 species. That can cause the symptoms of downward branch dieback. these fungi are characterized by the fact that they can feed on organic matter that is decomposing. They can be endophytic, which is one of the main characteristics of these fungi. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Endophytic means they are inside the tree, and they can also be pathogens. So they can cause disease, in this case, in the tree. So as we can see, one species may be saprotrophic, endophytic, or pathogenic. And we're going to talk about these different characteristics. So, as I mentioned, there are different fungi that are associated with this downward branch dieback. Primarily, the fungus that is most associated with this problem in mangoes is Lasiodiplodia. This is one of the genera of fungus, but there's also Pseudophysicocum, Neophysicocum, Diplodia, Neocitalidium, Philostita, yeah, and others. There are different genera of fungus that can cause downward branch dieback, and this has been reported in mangoes in different areas of the world. However, what we see most regularly associated with the symptoms of downward branch dieback is Lasiodiplodia. So, as I mentioned, the fungus that is most associated with this disease in mangoes is Lasiodiplodia. And there are different species within this genus. However, the one that is most associated or most reported in mangoes is Lasiodiplodia theobromae. This species of Lasiodiplodia, or Lasiodiplodia in general, has a certain characteristic, which is it's a fungus that has the ability to affect different trees, both fruit trees and forest trees. We talk about around 500 host plants. So you can imagine the capacity that this fungus has to infect trees. As I've mentioned, it doesn't just affect fruit trees, but rather it affects many forest trees. And within the fruit trees, it affects primarily those trees that are found in tropical climates. And obviously, to be able to infect a tree or cause damage, this damage is associated with certain characteristics, which we'll go over because those are closely related to orchard management. So, a while ago, I mentioned that this fungus, Lasiodiplodia, and a few others that can cause downward branch dieback, they have the capacity to be endophytic. What does endophytic mean? Well, it means that it's a fungus that has the capacity to survive and live inside the tree. So, primarily, it lives in the vascular system of the trees. So, it can remain there throughout the entire life of the tree. So, one of the ways that this fungus lives is it does not grow with the tree, but rather it is introduced. It is introduced by a series of factors and generally through injuries. These injuries could be caused by physical factors, like, for example, by pruning or other types of injuries caused by a person. If there are spores in the environment, those spores can enter those injuries, and the spore can then germinate and penetrate through those injuries.
Obviously, let me remind you that those spores are very small. So when there's an injury in a tree, if we put that into a microscope, we could see that the spore that is germinating is bigger. So it's easier for the disease to penetrate through the injuries. However, they can also penetrate through injuries caused by insects. Actually, there is a relationship between borer insects. These are insects who can bore the branches, and they can cause certain wounds, certain openings and injuries. And this opening can be exposed. For instance, if there's a source of inoculum, that is materials of the plant that brings spores of these fungi, they can penetrate through these injuries and through the wounds that those insects have caused. So this is a penetration method. And then once it is inside of the trunk, they can develop. Let me stop here because I want to mention something that is very important. In many studies that have been carried out, and in my case, I've been able to observe that in the field, we're talking about a fungi that is caused by stress. Let me clarify. They can be isolated in certain branches of a tree. For instance, you can take a piece of this branch and bring it to the lab, and in some occasions, it is likely that Lasiodiplodia can grow there. You can see the branches, and the branches look fine. However, the fungus is already there. It's already living there in an endophytic way. However, what happens when the tree starts to be stressed? When there are stress factors, this is when we start seeing the signals. We start seeing how the plant starts to become weak. Let's put it this way. Once the when the plant is fine, it can live together with the fungi and it's fine. However, when there's stress factors, then the fungus starts to become a pathogen instead of an endophytic form. And this is when we start seeing the symptoms in the plant. We start seeing the symptoms of downward branch dieback. So I wanted you to know that this fungus is mainly caused by stress. And the factors that can cause stress oftentimes can be controlled. We can manage them through different methods. We can reduce stress, and in turn, we can also reduce this pathogen. The main symptom, or rather, the main factor that will contribute to this transformation from a fungus that's inactive into a fungus that's a pathogen or that's violent has to do with hydric stress. For instance, if you have orchards, you can see that during the drought months, that is when there's a lack of rainfall, when there's no irrigation, when trees are not irrigated artificially by an irrigation system, and when the tree only lives from water from rainfall during rainy seasons. If you pay close attention, you will be able to see that generally in the periods when there's not enough water, you'll see that these problems start to intensify. It's not the only factor, but it is the main factor that we can see, the lack of water. However, there are other factors that can also trigger stress to plants. After the main factor, which is lack of water, the second one, or the one of the most common ones, would be the lack of nutrients in the tree, especially when the tree starts to have a lot of deficiencies of a macro or micronutrient, for instance, nitrogen, phosphorus, or another micronutrient. These are factors that can trigger stress in the plants. And then we also have other examples that have to do with different factors that can cause stress to the plants. For instance, problems that have to do with salinity or other important factors can also be observed in mango orchards, and those can be the lack of organic matter in the soil, especially when we're dealing with poor soils that have a lack of organic matter. And in addition to that, soils that are not commonly fertilized. These will be poor soils where we can also see more intense effect of this disease. Another factor has to do with the pH. We can see if it's an acidic soil or an alkaline soil. And these are all factors that can cause stress to the plant. And as a result, they can cause downward branch dieback in the mango crops. Now let's move on to the symptoms of this disease. We already went over the different fungi that can cause downward branch dieback. We have also talked about the factors that can contribute to the development of this disease. And now we're going to move over a little bit over symptoms. In downward branch dieback, what we see is that the infection starts at the very end, at the twigs or tips of the branches, which is the entryway of the pathogen. And usually, what we see is that the branches start getting dry, the twigs. Sometimes it starts in the very small branches. And what we see is that the leaves start becoming yellowish, or sometimes the leaves start falling off and the branch is completely exposed. Once we start observing these early symptoms, it's very common to see how the tips of the branches start drying off. However, sometimes we see that there's damage in the branches, but we don't take any action. And then in the next season, this disease, this damage keeps progressing. And if during the season there was a very strong lack of water, then the symptoms will progress at a much faster pace, because these are conditions that will help the fungus develop in a faster way. So the disease will move from the top downward, and it keeps progressing downward. And if no one manages the disease, for instance, if there's no pruning, sometimes this dryness will affect the main trunk. When this happens, and this is one of the main causes for death, tree deaths in the fields, is when we do not manage this dryness in time. And when the disease reaches the main trunk. When this happens, oftentimes it damages the whole trunk, and it's very likely that the tree or that the group of trees will end up dying. This means that the whole tree will be dried off and it will die. For instance, in Nayarit, where I am based in Mexico, we've seen this, and we've seen that the main cause for tree death has been associated to this type of disease, to the downward branch dieback. And this is only due to the fact that there's very little management of this disease. Once the farmer decides to start managing the disease is already very advanced and it's not effective. It's very hard to push back once the trees have been severely affected. I would like to stop here and talk a little bit about what this type of pathogen can cause to the plants. The pathogens that we're talking about are the Botryops varialis family pathogens. What they do is that they attack the cells. Of course, we see branches, but branches are formed out of cells, and the cells can form um, tissue, and this is what forms the branch as we see them. So, first of all, they produce a lot of secondary metabolites, which are toxic substances for the cells. And then on the other hand, they also produce a lot of enzymes. Enzymes have the capacity of degrading or dissolving, if you will, the cell wall of the branches. We see here only some of the cells, but remember, there are a lot of cells. For instance, let's imagine that we have these cells here and that there's an acid that comes in and that breaks down the membrane, the wall. And what happens is that everything that's contained inside of that wall can go out. And then what happens is that there's a release of sugar, which will feed in turn the fungus. And the fungus will start feeding off from these sugars and will start developing and growing and multiplying. And then we will start a new cycle where we have new fungi, more enzymes. And this is how the cycle starts over. And at some point, the enzymes will end up killing every single branch of the tree. This is a fungus that affects primarily the xylem. The xylem is a component that is also known as the vascular system of the plant, especially when we refer to mango trees and fruit trees in general. The vascular system is formed of different channels or ducts where sap, water, and nutrients are transported through a tissue. There's one called zoema and another one called a xylem. The first one is usually associated to sap and other things that are produced at the leaves. However, there's another part which is called the xylem. And in the xylem, this is where water goes through. The roots will absorb water, and together with the water, they will also absorb nutrients and minerals that will be transported through these ducts. These are very small ducts located in the trunk. And through those ducts, the nutrients and the water will flow. And this allows for the water to flow easily from the roots to the very end of the branches where the water is needed in order to produce fruits and other things. However, when the xylem is damaged, this is where we have the effects of this fungi, the Lasiodiplodia, which affects these water flow. And once this water flow is blocked, then all this part that you see here in this slide becomes destroyed. We have leaves, we have different twigs and branches, and the water cannot flow naturally. So what happens is that the whole system in the xylem is completely destroyed. And this is why we start seeing the symptoms at the tips of the branches that are starting to dry because that water flow has been interrupted and the nutrients flow has been interrupted as well. And this is how the leaves start to dry out and they start to die. And then the fungus starts going downward. And the symptoms, of course, from the branches will be more visible, they will be bigger. And finally, in many cases, the disease will reach the trunk.
So this is just a photograph from an electronic microscope. And these are cuts, in this case, of the xylem. And this is just to mention that this fungus, this is an electronic microscope. This is not something that you could see with a normal or general use microscope. And so here we can see cells. You can see here a quantity of cells. And what this fungus does, if you can see here, it destroys the xylem. And we can see here what it does. It macerates the tissue of the cell walls and destroys the cells. So this fungus we could say destroys the channels through which water and nutrients flow. So this is at the microscopic level. So this is the damage that can be observed microscopically, which is reflected in the damage to the branches, as I mentioned. So here we can see some of the symptoms of downward dieback in the branches. So it starts at the tip and starts going down progressively. And at some point, if nothing is done, if there's no management plan or pruning, all of these branches that you can see here and these leaves that you can see here are going to dry out, and this entire part will dry out completely. Here, you can see another one of the symptoms associated with dieback, branch dieback, is this sort of rubbery substance that the plant produces as a result of the presence of a pathogen, in this case, a fungus, that is affecting the branches. So the fungus, as a response, produces this rubbery substance, which is brownish in appearance. This is very common to see when trees are affected by downward dieback. But there's something very important here I'd like to mention. When you see this on a tree, which is healthy, many times when trees are healthy and vigorous and are being managed well, they may present these symptoms. If the tree is managed well, if it's irrigated and its nutrition is good, the tree can coexist with this fungus without significant damage. The problem is, however, when we see these symptoms, primarily when there are trees or orchards that are not fertilized, not irrigated, or are suffering other severe stress, that is when it's important to find out what might be causing these stress factors. So here we have some other examples, which are very common to see in damaged branches. This rubbery substance is a symptom of downward dieback. And here we have some more symptoms, this type of rubbery substance. And I think you'll have access to the presentation. So when you need to look at these photos, you're welcome to. As I mentioned, many times, or generally, this fungus, what it does is it creates damage to the vascular system. And it's very common when there's a lot of material and the branches are damaged. We can cut with a machete or something. And often we can see that the wood, in this case, has dark coloring, which is primarily due to this vascular damage that the fungus creates in the xylem. Here we have more examples of downward branch dieback, and here something important I wanted to mention was that generally downward branch dieback is more common in trees that are 6, 7 years old or older. Generally, it's not very common in younger trees. Of course, it is occasionally seen in younger trees, but it's not very common. It's more common to see it in trees that are about 7 years old and older. And here we have some more advanced symptoms of downward branch dieback. So often, the grower, at least here in Mexico and some other places, I don't mean to say all growers, but they sometimes want to start managing this issue when the symptoms are already very advanced. When the symptoms are already very advanced, of course, it's more difficult to recover the tree. So it's always important to address the symptoms as soon as they appear with management practices, especially pruning. because when the symptoms are more advanced, as on the left-hand photo, often it must be severely pruned or completely pruned and do another graft later. So, to manage this disease, really a lot has to do with when the symptoms are first seen. So, it's very important also to address the causes. And as I mentioned, the causes are stress factors. And here we have some symptoms as well of downward branch dieback. When it's just starting, as I mentioned, it's that this drying out starts high in the tree. And here we have some examples of trees in the field that didn't receive any type of management and were not pruned, and the disease advanced. And at some point, it kills the tree. In Nayarit, there are some orchards in which maybe 20-25% of trees may die on a hectare or more due to this disease. But this is due to the fact that there was no management plan to attempt to reduce or address this damage. Here we have more dead trees. So I mentioned a while ago regarding downward dieback that it is often also associated with insects, primarily boring insects. There are insects in this case that have the capacity. The female of an insect comes in, particularly Coleoptera, and these insects lay their eggs in the branch, and the larvae hatch. And I'm going to mention their names so you can recognize them. What they do is once they hatch, they start drilling holes in the branch. So they're starting to destroy the tissue of the branch, the xylem and other aspects of the tissue. And of course, this obstructs water from flowing through the branch. And these injuries also facilitate the entry of pathogens. If there are pathogens around, this allows them to enter. Often it's not the larva that causes the most harm, but rather the pathogen that is in the environment. So when there are boring insects, they can facilitate damage by Lasiodiplodia. So two of the primary families of Caloptera that are boring insects, primarily in fruit trees and forest trees, but there are different families, but I'm just going to mention two of the primary families, and these are the ones most associated with this problem, Ceram, and these are insects that are characterized by these very long antennae that can often be twice the length of the insect itself. It's very common to see them in trees. So the larvae tend to be between 1 and 4 or 5 centimeters. They can be larger on some occasions, but that's about the size, average size. And they have a large head. They are brownish or cream buff colored, and they look like these photos here. As I mentioned, you'll have access to this presentation, so you can use it as a reference. This is from the Cerambycidae family, and these are some of the most common boring insects that you might see in mangoes and other fruit trees. And then the other family is Buprestidae, and we'll look at those too so that you can differentiate the larva. Obviously, there are lots of species that affect different crops. A species does not just affect one species of trees. Many times, one species of certain BCDA may have a preference for a particular species of. Also, we have the Buprestidae family here on the screen, and they can be of different sizes from 1 to 4 centimeters approximately. There are different sizes depending on the species, but one of the characteristics that you can use to differentiate them is that generally these larvae are characterized by having a large head and a very narrow body. So you can see these species here, and they have folds. And this is not the case of, for example, butterflies and others. They don't have the same number of segments. They have very large heads, and they're sort of buff colored, and the body is quite thin. So these are the two most common larvae that you might encounter. So it's very important when you see branches that are dry, it's important to inspect the branches, cut them to determine if there is any indication of the presence of these larvae, because these insects can also generate the drying of branches. So, some handling practices or management practices that are helpful, we had already mentioned that this is a stress problem. So, well, what do we do? Of course, obviously, we need to reduce the stress in the plant. Many growers use certain practices, and I have worked with growers and advised growers. And the first thing they ask me is, what product should I use? What fungicide can help me eliminate this problem? As you can see, this problem is not on the leaves, but rather the branches and the vascular system. So when you apply a fungicide, generally, often the fungicide acts on the leaves or the branches or the smallest twigs or newest twigs. But on the thicker branches, that fungicide really doesn't have the capacity to penetrate the larger branches. And they also tend not to be very systemic in their effect, very few of them. Potassium phosphate, is a substance that can induce resistance and also contributes to tree nutrition through potassium phosphate. And there are other types as well. But as I mentioned, if you apply a product like that, like this, it is not going to solve the problem because the problem is created by stress. So, as we said, it's important to evaluate the stress factors that are affecting the orchard. It's important to look at, for example, if there's sufficient water, if the soil is poor, and you can do a soil analysis to determine how much organic material is in the soil, or nutrients, or it could be very acidic or alkaline. So this has to do with general management practices. But if this is done, you will not only be controlling this disease, but many other potential diseases. Why? Because you can prevent stress in the plant, in the tree. And when a tree is healthy and not stressed, it is stronger and more resistant, and it makes it much more tolerant to diseases and pests.
And as I was saying, it's very important to check what are the factors that will trigger that. Something that I was mentioning before is that it's very important not to wait for the symptoms to become apparent. Once you see the first symptoms, you need to prune. And I would recommend pruning about 50 centimeters from the edge of the branch so that we can prevent the fungus from going into other parts that doesn't show any symptoms. So it's important to prune a little lower than the edge. The branches need to be removed, especially those that have symptoms that have dried off. We need to take them away from the orchard. We cannot leave them there because those branches, as we know, are invaded by the fungus. Those pictures that I showed you, the xylem that I showed you, has affected the branches from only one side. However, if this branch ends up on the soil, what happens is that the mycelium will start producing spores, and those spores will stay on the ground. If a lot of branches end up falling on the soil, they will start producing a large amount of spores with that fungus. And the spores, in turn, will start contaminating other trees that are close by or in the same orchard. So, as you can see, there will be a larger source of inoculum, and it could be easily spread throughout the whole orchard, especially if there are certain conditions. And something very important that I wanted to mention is that if you're going to prune, it's very important to prune when it's not rain season. Because if it's raining and you're pruning and you create cuts and there's humidity and the spores are very close by, the spores can end up into the wounds, into the injuries, and with humidity and with a certain temperature, the fungi will be able to penetrate easily into the tree. So first of all, you have to prune, yes. And when we prune, if the branches are very thick, we need to seal them. How do we seal them? We can use a mix of calcium, for instance, with a sealant, with paint, and we need to avoid the entrance of new pathogens. And another piece of advice is that after pruning, we need to apply or spray some sort of fungicide. You can apply a contact product, or, for instance, you can apply mango sap or other products. If you have solvency, you could mix a systemic product with a copper product, for instance, with mango sec, with an authorized product such as Trebengasol, Tecto, which is the commercial brand, but there are many other brands, and you can apply that product after you prune. If you apply this solution thinking that you will be able to stop the problem, it's not going to be efficient. Another important thing that I wanted to highlight is that we need to disinfect the tools that you use. If there's a tree affected by dieback and you use some sort of tool or a cutter or scissors, or for instance, if you have a more specialized machinery such as a pruning tool, it's very important that if you are pruning with a tool that you will reuse for another tree, for another healthy tree, it's very important to clean it very well after cleaning the infected tree. Why? Because when we're pruning, even if you don't see it, in this case, you can be bringing the fungus from one wound to another tree, and involuntarily you will be spreading the disease from one damaged tree into a healthy tree. So it's very, very important to disinfect, to clean it very well. And how do we do it? Well, a very easy and cheap solution is using chlorine. We can use a 10% concentration, which means 1 liter, and we would use 900 milliliters of water with 10 milliliters of chlorine. You can also use ammonia. You can use, for instance, 3,000 or 4,000 or even 5,000 parts by million. This would be another possible solution to disinfect the tools. As I was mentioning before, when I was talking about the previous slide, it's here we have a repetition. As you can see, it's very important to get rid of the branches so that they don't become a source of disease so that they don't contaminate other trees that could be healthy. As you can see, the management of this disease is not uh, one single solution because there are several factors that will contribute to that disease. So I think that we need to have a wholesome approach, an integrated approach, in order to avoid the stress factors that are contributing to this disease. For instance, irrigation is a very important one. We need to bring water to the plant to avoid the stress factor. We also need to do pruning, as I was mentioning. Another very important factor is nutrition, as well as soil management, pest and disease management, and farm cleaning, especially when we see trees that are showing dieback symptoms and that they have a lot of leaves, dead leaves on the soil. It's very important to clean it out to make sure that those branches that have fallen on the soil are removed so that we can avoid this source of inoculum. Another important tool or factor would be to clean the orchards. So as you can see, we need to irrigate, we need to take care of nutrition, and we need to do sufficient soil management. Here we have suggestions for organic amendments. This is also very important because we have realized that the most severe damage that we see from this disease happens on soils that are very poor, that they have very little organic matter. And I don't know, maybe it's wise for you to analyze your own soil. Maybe you could do some testing because if you improve the soil conditions, you will see that the plant will become healthier. And this is what we call organic amendments. These are all the substances that we can apply to the soil that will help improve the structure of the soil and that will be contributing nutrients to the soil. And currently, it has been noted, and in my case, I have been able to see that these type of solutions can help salinity of the plant when we incorporate beneficial microorganisms. And this is, of course, a very complex topic, but I'm only mentioning a few examples, a few things that you can do to improve the soil. Maybe you can add some fungi that can help improve the soil as well as the health of the tree because the tree will be able to absorb the nutrients. The tree will have more resistance to droughts and diseases. And in addition, we can also apply compost and other substances that will bring organic matter to the soil. For instance, fish emulsions or earthworm humus, manure. Obviously, everything has to go through a compost system first so that we can eliminate those microorganisms that could be harmful. There are, for instance, organic fertilizers as well that can be used. These are all strategies that can improve the composition of the soil. If we have a soil that's well equipped with a very good organic matter and that has been adequately handled, even if it's during rainfall season, if the soil is healthy, the tree will be more tolerant to stress and maybe it won't even show any symptoms. Why? Because it has a lot of nutrients and microorganisms in the soil. So, this is one of the main tools that you can use in order to improve or reduce stress factors. And of course, this will cause a higher tolerance against disease and plagues. Oh, there was another slide that I think we're missing. It's a slide that brought about some suggestions about how to maybe not to remove the whole disease, but it could help to reduce the damage in certain trees. And what I'm suggesting here is endotherapy. Endotherapy is introducing certain fungicides or nutrients in the trunk of the tree. It can be done through a boring process. First of all, we need to bore with some sort of drill the surface of the trunk, and then we can use certain equipment. It can be specialized equipment, or it can also be just the plain normal syringes with enough pressure. And we can use this equipment to introduce, through this equipment, we can introduce fungicide directly into the vascular system of the tree. Obviously, it will depend on how thick the trunk is, and we need to measure the amount of produce that we can introduce and the number of borings that we can drill. And the control will be the management of the tree will now be more directed, especially in trees that are showing symptoms that are maybe on the onset or that are not completely dead. We can try this type of strategy in order to help the tree to become healthier, and in this case, to avoid its death. For mango trees, this is a new method. I haven't seen it in mango trees. I have never seen it. It has not been studied yet. I don't know the dosage. I don't know what type of products will be used in other crops. This strategy has already been used on a very daily basis in order to reduce and attack certain diseases in mango crops. This is something that I think could be studied to see if it can be effective, because I think that it could be a tool that can help us reduce damage in those orchards that have already been developing this type of disease. As I was saying, you can either use highly sophisticated equipment or you can use plain syringes that we use for injections for other types of medicine. Here, I only wanted to point out that we have another symptom, or maybe not a symptom, but a factor that can contribute to the drying out of the branches and eventually uh, death of the tree. I was talking about this with other researchers, and they have already heard about it. And they were telling me that this has never occurred in mango trees. And I was trying to do some research on this issue, but I haven't seen that it has been reported for mangoes. Probably because it hasn't been studied yet. Because this happens in many other trees, especially in forest trees. In this case, is mortality by dryness in these trees because of climate change. Currently, we have been seeing that we have been impacted by climate change throughout the years, and it has to do with changes in climate as well as the impacts that it creates, mainly in water sources.
And this affects the water supply. And of course, these changes are meaning that it's not raining in areas where it generally does rain. So that's leading to a shortage of water and death of trees. What has been found in areas where there's been a shortage of water and tree death, this is primarily due to something that's known as embolisms. The trees can suffer these embolisms, and these embolisms prevent the water from flowing freely. And as a result, the trees die. And I'm going to explain how these embolisms develop. I'm not an expert in this, but I'm going to explain how it happens. And I don't know if this is already happening in mango trees and causing the death of trees, but this could be a factor that is affecting mango trees. That is something I'm not sure about, but it could be the case. So, studies have been done like in 2014. Studies began to be done in different areas of the world with different types of forest trees. And approximately, well, in the areas where this sampling was done, 60% approximately of the trees that had died of different species, they had died due to some type of embolism due to water shortage. And in more recent studies that have been done, it was shown that about 70% of 226 forest tree species in 81 sites throughout the world are at risk if they continue to be under hydraulic stress. They are at risk of these embolisms because of lack of water. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, to explain a little bit about how this comes about, it's important to talk about how plants obtain water from the soil. Well, plants begin to show transpiration, plants transpire, and they create negative pressure. It's like a pump, and that pump suctions the water from the roots up through the tree to the different tissues. And that force is known as negative force. So that's the force that pulls the water up through the tree to the branches and to the top of the tree. But the water molecules stay together thanks to cohesive forces. The key cohesive forces is what causes the water molecules to stay together. And when the negative pressure or when the pump begins to suction, when there's sufficient water, the water travels upward with no problem. But what happens when there isn't much water? When there isn't enough water, then the negative pressure is much greater. That is, the pump, the suction pump, creates more pressure. So that separates those cohesive forces. And as a result, this creates bubbles, gas bubbles. So gas bubbles are formed through a process called cavitation. So this is when the water changes from liquid to vapor. So this is due primarily to the fact that the suction is greater than the strength of the cohesive forces that keeps the water together. And so these bubbles form, gas bubbles, and then these gas bubbles obstruct the water from flowing to the other portions of the tree. And since the water can't flow, the water cannot get to where it is needed. And at some point, the tree dies. So this is primarily due to this phenomenon. And this is happening in many places throughout the world where there's been shortages of water for long periods of time. And most of the trees have died due to this factor. This is what has been studied. And in fact, it is still being studied in order to predict the zones that are likely to be more affected by this issue. And these are areas that have many trees and may be quite affected by climate change. In the case of mango trees, I really don't know if this is already taking place, but this is something that I think really should be studied, or at least it's important to keep in mind that this could be a factor that may affect trees. It's important to mention as well that not all trees are subject to these embolisms. And the studies that have been done, it depends about a lot on the structure of the xylem because there are trees that have a greater tolerance for these types of issues. And this is what I was mentioning a moment ago, that this phenomenon takes place because the negative pressure is greater than the quantity of water available for the plant. And so generally speaking, this would be like a slogan. It's important to keep mango trees healthy. This would be ideal in many orchards. I know this is not the case for different reasons, and one of the limiting factors is the economic factor. So it's very important to pay a lot of attention to the orchard and think about what we can do to attempt to reduce stress factors as much as possible. But generally, to maintain mangoes healthy and productive, it's important to reduce stress, to avoid diseases, and to protect the trees from the impacts of climate change. And most diseases that affect human beings as well, many of them are also due to stress factors. And trees are living beings as well. So it's not surprising that stress would be one of the trigger factors that makes trees more vulnerable. Last slide. I think we've come to the end, and I hope that this information has been useful for you. And thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions, Leo. So I'm here ready to answer questions if there are any questions. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Gómez, for your presentation and for the information that you provided us. We do have several questions, Rafael, but we are also over time. So maybe just a few short answers. And among the questions that we have, Dr. Gómez, one of the questions is, and this question is from Mr. Nehat. He says, would you please provide the reference that indicates that these fungi are stress-driven pathogens? So if you have the reference, you could send it to us, and we have the attendee's email address, and we can send it to Dr. Nehat. Yes, there are many references that talk about stress, not just in mangoes, but in many crops. Yes, exactly. And also, Mr. Nehat comments that it's very interesting to see that these pathogens get into the trunk. And if you could send that reference as well, that would be useful. Okay, great. And then the other question is a question from Diane Brown. And it says, or the question is, does the fungus affect the appearance of the fruit? Yes. In fact, well, here we were just talking about downward branch dieback, but this fungus also has the characteristic of producing other diseases, such as stem rot, and it does affect the quality of the fruit. And it can be infected in the field when the trees are infected, and the fungus is in the stem. So when it begins to mature, it is introduced to the stem, or if it's in the stem, it begins to rot. So the spores often are on the ground, and when the trees are harvested and left on the ground, that's one way that the fungus can adhere to the fruit, and the fruit begins to rot. But that would be another presentation. Great. Thank you, doctor. And then we have a question from Dr. Perez Barraza. And the question is it only through proper management that this can be addressed, or is there any kind of treatment to the trunk that can help control it? Yes, as I was mentioning a moment ago, it's really an integral management because, as I mentioned, it's a stress effect that can be caused by different factors. But really, the important thing is to manage the orchard to reduce stress factors. And I mentioned that the application of fungicides on the foliage really will not be very effective if the trees are not pruned and if the other management strategies are not also implemented. And then, thirdly, as I mentioned, in other crops such as avocados, endotherapy has been used, particularly in trees that are more susceptible or that have more advanced damage, or trees that are just showing symptoms. Uh, we can inject certain products such as fungicides or pesticides or nutrients. But I don't believe this has been done in mangoes. It's something that should be studied. I don't know which products would be used because they've been used in avocados, but they'd have to be tested in mangoes. Thank you, Rafael. Another question from Pericles Maes is whether there's an option of using copper sulfate and white lime paint in order to seal off wounds, cut off the branches, and seal off the ends. It used to be called blue Bordeaux mix. Yes, that can be used. The idea is when you do use those types of mixes, it should not be very liquid, a very thin liquid. It should be thicker so that it can adhere better to the trunk. Because if it's very liquid, it might just run off and really not provide good coverage. It should be pretty thick. And we have a last question, Dr. Gómez, from Arlen Espinosa. It says, "Good morning, Dr. Rafael. Excellent presentation, very valuable for mango growers. I wanted to ask you if the excessive use of paclobutrazol could contribute to the development of this disease." Well, I don't think any study has been done in this regard, but what I can say is that if you have an orchard that is not receiving a lot of water and the trees are stressed, if you apply paclobutrazol, remember that paclobutrazol can cause stress in many trees. When paclobutrazol is applied, the tree generally does suffer some level of stress. So if your orchard is stressed and you apply paclobutrazol, this is going to likely increase the stress problems. And we have more questions.
Mr. Miguel Encinas asks, is downward branch dieback similar to Texas root rot? And the answer is no, it's not similar. Usually in downward branch dieback, the damages are seen in the tips of the branches. However, in the case of Texas root rot, this is a fungus that affects especially the roots of the trees, and it's highly associated to soils, for instance, that have been affecting a lot of different species. It doesn't have a lot of hosting plants, but for instance, in cotton farms or other types of crops that have been there before, and then when people start planting mango trees, if that problem had been there in the past, then it can reproduce. However, this fungus has been caused by conditions that have to do with the pH. Specifically, this type of disease develops easily in alkaline soils. So one of the solutions would be to apply some to change the pH of the soil. But this is totally different than our disease that we're dealing with today. Dr. Froilan Rodriguez says thank you for your presentation and congratulations. And the question is, what's the most if there are certain varieties of mango that are more likely to get this disease? And the answer is no. What I've seen is that if the management is very poor, it doesn't matter what variety we're dealing with. If there's stress factors and if there's a source of inoculum, and in my case, I haven't seen that any variety has more tolerance or not. Specifically, what I've seen, as I've mentioned before, everything has to do with how we manage the orchard. So the factors are water, nutrients, things like that. This would be the most determining factor. We also have a question from Mario Monson, and the question is, what's the best season to go about sanitation and pruning of mango trees? What I was saying before is that ideally we need to prune when it's not raining. This would be ideal. However, when pruning are not done in time, this will also have some consequences, especially for the fruit for the next season. The new flowers, the new fruits will be affected by that too. And then obviously we need also to take into account what region you are in. There are areas, for instance, where there's hardly any rainfall, so you can easily prune at any time. However, if you live in an area where there's a lot of rainfall, what I recommend is to seal the areas that you've been pruning. And another strategy could also be to apply contact and systemic products so that you can avoid, in this case, you can reduce the number of spores, the number of the source of inoculum that could be contaminating the injuries that were caused by your pruning. And finally, Dr. Gómez, we have one last question from Dr. David Villanueva, who says, good afternoon. You explained today that the pathogen could be in the tree, and however, the tree could not show any symptoms. And the question is, once the pathogen has symptoms, will this happen in smaller branches or in thicker ones? Generally, it will start happening in thinner branches. This is one of the most common symptoms that we see. The symptoms will start appearing in the top of the branches, the smaller branches. And as I was saying, sometimes it's easy to isolate those smaller branches, and we can cut them and we can use them in a culture environment, and the fungus can keep developing. Actually, I've been seeing that in a doctorate thesis that I've been working on in Mexico. And we were working and doing research on that, and we've seen that this is a very important problem, that once we isolate the fungi from other branches that are completely healthy, it can still be there. It can still develop even if we don't see the symptoms. And it's all always triggered by stress factors. We will now close the question session. And thank you so much, Dr. Gomez. Thank you for your presentation and for being here in our webinar. And I hope that we can invite you in future seminars. I wanted to invite you to our next webinar on July 25th, 2024, with Dr. Italo Cavalcante from Brazil. The topic of his presentation will be improving the quality of mangoes. The webinar will be at the same time at 3 p.m. EST. Thank you so much to all of the participants, to Dr. Rafael Gómez. Thank you so much for your presentation. And this is all for today. Have a great afternoon. Bye bye. Thank you.